Good morning, everyone. It is November 11th, 2019, and we are so close to ending 2019 and moving on to a more even number, 2020. Today, we are beginning our comparison, our actual test of the Sony MDR Z7Mk2. I already have the Mark I, and the reason that Sony released the Mark II, on top of wanting more money, I'm sure, is because a lot of people were unhappy with the Mark I's performance. One of the things that happened is that Sony is a big proponent of high-res audio, because high-res is a sticker that you put on boxes to say that this is high-quality, hi-fi gear. It's just a standard that was created in Japan, and all the Japanese companies, audio companies, want to have that sticker. So they all conform to one little specification or another, or a group of specifications, and they get that little sticker. And so it makes people think that this is audiophile gear because it's got that high-res sticker on it, which may or may not be the case. Well, with the Mark I, they got that sticker, and audiophiles purchased this product, and they were a little unhappy with the way that the bass was reproduced in the Mark I. The consistent complaint was that the Mark I had very loose, distorted, warm bass, which tended to not reproduce the sub-bass frequency accurately. And apparently the complaints were vocal enough, there were enough of them for Sony to go back to the drawing board and change the driver to retune it. The impedance is different with the Mark II. It's 56 ohms. I think the original were 32 ohms, if I'm not mistaken. And the retuning actually does appear when you do an A and B test. There is a clear difference between the original and the Mark II. But there is more to it than that. You know, this video is about the bass response, and we're going to get to it in a couple of moments. But I want to point out something that I discovered while going back and forth and testing and retesting the bass, is that I was surprised to find a very unique concern. And it's only a concern if you don't have the right amplifier. So even though this headphone has 56 ohm drivers, the headphone requires power. It requires power for the drivers to come alive. Indeed, I have been sitting here for an hour and testing this over and over again with single-ended, with XLR, with different songs, testing the volume pot on my amplifier versus trying to test on the volume in software, and going back and forth for an hour. And the finding is very consistent. So I'm just going to come right out and tell you that in order to really utilize the Mark II's driver, to really get it to work, and it works well when it does, is you need a very powerful amplifier. Now, the amplifier that I chose for this test is the Audio GD 1 amp. The 1 amp has, let me just take you to the website, the 1 amp has 9.9 watts of power for headphone output. Now, this is a pre-out as well, so you can, a preamplifier, so you could, but I'm not talking about the pre, I'm talking about the headphone amplifier itself. 9.9 watts at 25 ohms. 8 watts at 40 ohms. This is 56 ohms, so you could expect somewhere around 8 watts of power peak that you can get. And I am using the XLR output. I have an XLR cable, and I've got balanced. The reason I'm doing balanced is because Audio GD doesn't tell me what the single-ended power output is. And there is a noticeable difference. I just don't know what it is, so I didn't think it was fair to go buy just a single-ended, so that's why I have my XLR plugged in. It's not so low distortion or anything like that. It's not the issue. It's because I needed to really visualize the power and figure out, is this true? Is it true that the Mark II requires power in order to work? And it tends to be the case. That's at least my finding for the bass response. Okay? So we are going to start our test, and we are starting with Pure Water by Mustard and Migos. Then we're going to our second song, Angel by Massive Attack, and then finally Drum Solo by Jack Bruce and Simon Phillips. The idea is that we get 3 different variant bass songs. They're all very different from each other in how they reproduce bass, how the bass is recorded, what instruments are used. So hopefully this will give us a kind of a wide swath in order to determine how the bass does sound on the Mark II. As I said, I've got the headphones plugged into XLR into the Audio GD1 amp, which is itself being fed by the SMSL SU8, which is balanced. So balance to balance to balance. Everything is balanced here. It's on high gain currently, and the volume is at 110. So let's start with pure water. Here we go. And at 110, it might as well be muted. So I'm going to increase, and I'll tell you at the point where it's at, I can actually start hearing it. Okay, at 125, it's loud enough for me to almost not be able to hear my voice. And the bass is very subdued. The vocals are clear, they're up front. The bass is somewhere in the background, and you could be forgiven if you're thinking, where is the bass? I don't hear it. There's supposed to be a rumble here, and I don't hear the rumble. The drum strikes is not really audible. The vocals are the only thing I really do hear clearly. I don't hear the bass very much. And for a song like this, which is a hip-hop song, the bass is very, very important to have. This is the type of song that Beats headphones are made for, and I can't get it. So let's increase the volume, and I'll tell you exactly when the bass comes alive, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. We are at 140. Okay, so we went from 120 to 140. 20 steps higher, and now that bass is thumping. The vocals are crystal clear. The drum strikes are much more present than they were at lower volume. It's a night and day difference where I could barely hear the bass at lower volume. 20 steps below, now 20 steps higher, 140, I clearly hear it. And the ear cups are vibrating a little bit more. There's a good separation between the bass and the mids. There's no melding of the two. The sub bass and the mid bass, that's a little bit melded together. There's not a hardline separation between the two. So I'm going to increase the volume again. We are at 147, and any louder, and I'm convinced that my eardrums would explode. At high gain, the 1 amp goes to 163. We're at 147. And now with 147, that drum is actually alive, and that and the mids are crystal clear. The ear cups are vibrating. Now let's go all the way back down to 120. And at 120, it's not just that the volume is lower. I'm going to stop the music. It's not just that the volume is lower. It's just that the bass kind of disappears. You know, there are a lot of times when you get a headphone and you plug it in, and let's say you're listening at a low volume, and you increase to something that drowns out your voice if you're talking a normal conversation voice like this. And at that point, the headphone just becomes louder. The characteristic of the headphone, the way that each frequency range is presented doesn't change. It's just louder. Well, that's not the case with the Mark II. At lower volume, with less power, the Mark II become muted in the bass. You can hear the bass if you pay close attention, but really it is hard to find it. When you pump more power into the headphones, all of a sudden the bass comes alive. You can hear the drum strikes, you can hear the sub bass, you can hear the rumbling, you can indeed start feeling the ear cups shaking. And on top of that, the vocals become clearer with more power input. And that was a surprise for me, like I said, when I was testing for an hour back and forth, trying all different things in order to get this to make sense. And the only conclusion that I've been able to reach that is of any significance is that it's just the driver. The driver requires the power in order to come alive. You need an amplifier that can push that power to the headphones. And look, 40 ohms is 8 watts on the 1 amp. We're talking about 56 ohms, so there's not a huge variance here. So I'm just going to say 8 watts for the sake of argument. We're getting close to a lot of peak power being sent to these headphones in order for these drivers to come alive. That's not to say that the headphones are going to work poorly with portable devices, but if we're talking about a desktop device working at peak performance, high gain, where 147 is when everything is just right in its element, and the maximum at high gain on 1 amp is 163, you kind of imagine that maybe you need a powerful amplifier for this thing to work, despite the fact that these are 56 ohm headphones. I don't know. We'll continue to test and we'll find out. Okay, so let's go to Angel by Massive Attack, and let's start. And at 135, I can barely hear myself speaking. That rumble has definitely come up. You can hear the rumble. The bass strikes actually become bass strikes, the drum strikes. Originally, they just sounded like a muddy bass, and now with more power, it sounds clear. I can hear the rumbly bass. I can hear the drum strikes. I can hear the vocalist clear. Good separation between the bass and the mids. I'm going to increase the volume again to about 140. And that 5-step increase. And the drum strikes become clearly audible. Right now you got the drums are going, and I'm going to decrease to 120 and see what happens. Yeah, at 120 compared to 140, the 20-step difference, the drums are barely audible. The vocals are audible, but not the drum strike. They're a little bit too muted. It's almost as if somebody took the mix and they put a thick comforter on the bass frequency and it's just muffled. You can't really hear it. Increase the power by 20 steps on the amplifier and all of a sudden it just comes alive. Even at 130, 10 steps higher, the bass just comes alive. You can start hearing the drums more clearly. So some might say, look, this is what typically happens with headphones. You need to increase the volume to hear the song. Well, that really is dependent upon the amplifier and your headphone. Now, this amplifier, as I said, is 10 watts, 9.9 watts, 10 watts at 25 ohms, 8 watts at 40 ohms, and 56 ohm headphones. We're arguing that it's about 8 watts, essentially. So power is not the issue with this amplifier. What is the issue? Well, if it's not the power, then the other side of the equation means that it's the driver, it's the headphone. And this is consistent again with the prior song that we tested, Pure Water, is that the lower volumes, less power, the headphones simply don't reproduce the character of the bass, the visceralness of the bass, the clarity of the bass, the separation of the bass, mid-bass, sub-bass, and the drum strikes cleanly, clearly, audibly as they do at higher volume, equating to more power. Let's go to our third song, Drum Solo by Jack Bruce and Simon Phillips. We have the amp at 130. Let's keep it there. Here we go. And at 130, I can barely hear the drum being, like the bottom of the drum falling up, boing, boing. I can barely hear that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to increase to 140. And I'm going to go back. Yeah. And at 140, 10 steps higher, that sound of the drum falling out, boing, boing, sounds absolutely clear. There is no mistaking it. 10 steps higher, you can clearly hear it. 10 steps lower, back down at 130, it's a little bit harder to hear. And at 10 steps below that, 120, I can't tell what it is. I mean, I know it's supposed to be there, but it sounds really muffled. So add more power, increase the volume, and all of a sudden this driver starts coming alive. Let's go a little bit further ahead to when we have the drum solo actually starting. We're at 140. The cymbal crashes are crystal clear. Each drum strike has its own character. You can hear each individual drum strike, very, very fast resonance. So you hit, move on, hit, move on. The ear cups are shaking a little bit. I'm going to increase from 140 to 145. And 145 is the loudest I would ever recommend anybody listen. I mean, if you have the one app, then you know what I mean. In fact, the left ear cup is just shaking. And the driver is just alive. I'm going to decrease to 130. And come down to 130. The drums sound muffled in comparison to 140. Bring it down to 120. At 120, it sounds a bit more muffled than it did at 130. Bring it down to 110. And at 110, you can barely hear the drums individually. They sound more muddy even more. More muddy even more. They sound more muddy. So that is the gist of it. Like I said, I sat here for an hour testing back and forth, XLR single-ended, software volume pod on the amplifier, and it was consistent. And doing the actual test here now, recording it, it's consistent again. These headphones require power. Now that begs the question, if you buy these headphones, do you need to buy an extremely powerful amplifier? And I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. We will definitely have to test with other portable amplifiers and see if we can get the same response. But the question would then be, if I can get the same response from, say, a Q5, then that would mean that the Audio GD 1 amp is faulty. It's not giving me peak power, 9.9 watts or 8 watts or 7 watts. It's not giving it to me, which I don't think is consistent with the way that it's been performing so far. But we shall see. I leave that option open. That's still a possibility. Overall, I think that the bass response for the Mark II is, when you have sufficient volume, sufficient power, I think it's very, very clear. It's tight bass response. It's I was going to say resolution. No, the reverberation is very fast. So it's quick. It's very quick. It doesn't linger. At lower volumes with less power, you get kind of a muddy sensation in the bass and the sub bass. But when you add more power to the headphone, all of that separation comes back. So you get the separation of the sub bass from the mid bass, and then you get a clear separation from the bass and the mids. The mids come out clearly, no distortion that I can hear. It's a little bit harder to hear the vocals at the lower volume with less power, but the vocals are still ahead of the bass. When you increase the volume, you increase the power, everything just tightens up more with this driver. It's almost like, you have a rubber band and you stretch out the rubber band, and when you have that tension, now you can start hearing when you play the rubber band, dong, 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 right? You start hearing that. When it's not stretched out, then you're not getting the sound of a stretched rubber band. Does that even make sense? If it doesn't, I apologize. It's the best analogy I could come up with in the moment. Short of it is this. If you have a good amplifier, a powerful amplifier, the Mark II is going to perform for bass tight, no looseness, no distortion, and no muddiness. But if you're going to listen to this headphone for the bass only, we're talking about here, if you listen to it at low volumes, then I think you really are going to miss out on the character of these drivers. You will not get you won't get the separation of the sub bass and the mid bass. You're not going to get it at lower volume. The volume for the mids is also affected. So the less power that you have in the headphones, the less obvious the mids become, the less obvious the vocals are. The more power you put into the drivers, everything just kind of jumps up. All the driver comes alive, and you can hear the separation and the clarity. So hopefully this has been of some help. If you have any questions or concerns, please leave them in the comment section below. If you want to ask me to review a product I currently own, then please look at the product review request form in the description below and fill that out, submit it, and I'll get to your request as soon as I can. If you like this content, if you like any of my other content, then I would ask that you might consider joining me on Patreon. Even just $2 a month would go a long way to helping me save up money to buy new products that I will review for you, thoroughly review, get into the nitty-gritty, talk about sound signature and comparisons, the type of things that other reviewers typically don't do. I hope all of you have a wonderful, amazing rest of your Monday and a great end to the beginning of this week. A great end, beginning of this week? A great end to your week. How about that? Let's do a great end to your week. I hope all of you take care.